Okay, I hope I'm audible to all the students who are attending this lecture of Introductory Microeconomics. In the last lecture of Introductory Microeconomics, we were studying about demand, okay? And we were doing some of the factors affecting the demand for a commodity. So we continue with the same topic, factors affecting the demand for a commodity. Okay, so let's talk about the factors affecting the demand for a commodity. Now, in the previous lecture, we had talked about own price of a commodity and the income of the consumer and price of related goods. We were on this factor. Okay, so this was our third factor, if you all can recall, price of related goods. Now, within this we had done substitutes, if all of you can recall. Substitutes covered in the previous lecture. Okay, let's talk about complements now. So when are two goods said to be perfect complements? Two goods are said to be perfect complements okay, if they are used in a fixed proportion, if they are used in a fixed proportion to satisfy a want. So again, you know this from high school, two goods are said to be perfect complements if the consumer can use them in place of if the consumer can use them in a fixed proportion. That means both the goods have to be consumed together in a fixed proportion to satisfy a want. Example, left shoe and right shoe. You can't manage with one shoe, you need both the shoes. You need a pair. Pen and ink. You cannot use the pen without the ink. There is no use of the ink without the pen. Okay. Similarly, computer and software are perfect complements. Okay. So let's now talk about what happens when the price of complement good goes up. When the price of complement good goes up. Another example is car and petrol. So for example, let's take the example of car and petrol. If price of petrol goes up, what will happen to demand for petrol cars? Obviously, the demand for petrol cars will fall. So when price of complement good goes up, demand for own commodity will fall, which implies the demand curve for own commodity will shift to the left. If the complement good becomes more expensive, you will start demanding less of the own commodity. Example, if price of petrol goes up, demand for petrol cars will fall. As a result, the demand curve will shift to the left. Exactly the opposite will happen when the price of complement good falls, demand for the own commodity increases, which implies that the demand curve for own commodity will shift to the right. Example, when petrol becomes cheaper and price of petrol falls, demand for petrol driven cars will go up, demand curve will shift to the right. So what do we observe? There exists an inverse relationship. There exists an inverse relationship between the price of the complement good and the demand for the own commodity. Okay, there exists an inverse relationship between price of complement good and demand for own commodity. When price of complement good goes up, demand for own commodity falls. When price of complement good falls, demand for own commodity goes up. So inverse relationship. So guys, if I sum up from the previous lecture as well, when we talk about substitutes, there is a direct relationship between price of substitute good and demand for commodity. I repeat, there is a direct relationship between price of a substitute good and demand for own commodity. But when we talk about complements, there is an inverse relationship between price of the complement good and demand for the own commodity. So I hope students have understood complements. Then moving forward to the fourth factor affecting demand, tastes and preferences. Now, this is also an important factor affecting the demand for a commodity. So, if there is a favorable change in tastes, if there's a favorable change in taste, it implies demand for the own commodity goes up, which implies that the demand curve will shift to the right. If the consumer develops a favorable change in taste means if the consumer starts liking the commodity, demand for own commodity will go up, which implies demand curve will shift to the right. And exactly, you can make the opposite change. If there is an unfavorable change, if there is an unfavorable change in taste, it implies demand for own commodity falls, which implies that the demand curve will shift to the left. You can clearly see that there has been a favorable change in tastes towards the non-veg food. Okay, especially among the Indians as well. So you can see the demand for chicken, the demand for fish, the demand for the non-veg commodities have gone up because there has been a favorable change in the society's tastes towards these commodities. Okay, so this is one such example. You can have many other examples as well. Fifth factor affecting the demand for a commodity, expectations. Expectations about the price. What will be the price in the near future? That will also affect your demand today. So I can write 2 points on this. If the consumer expects the price of the commodity to increase in the future, if the consumer expects the price of the commodity to rise in the future, demand for the commodity today will increase and the demand curve will shift to the right. If you expect the price of the commodity to rise tomorrow, what will you do today? Today you will buy more of it. If you expect the price to rise tomorrow, today you will buy more of it, and demand curve will shift to the right. Similarly, if the consumer expects the price of the commodity to fall in the future, it implies demand for the commodity today will fall. If I know that the commodity is going to become cheaper tomorrow, I will demand less today, and the demand curve will shift to the left. So you all have seen how expectations also affect the demand for a commodity. Okay, so moving forward to the sixth and the last point for factors affecting demand, number of buyers. Okay, so this is again very simple. If the number of buyers of a particular commodity, if the number of buyers of a particular commodity go up, maybe due to brand following, due to advertising, we don't know the reason. If the number of buyers of any particular commodity go up, demand for that particular commodity will increase, and the demand curve will shift to the right. And exactly the opposite will happen if the number of buyers of a particular commodity fall, demand for that particular commodity will fall, and the demand curve will shift to the left. So I hope all students attending the lecture have understood all the factors. So there are 6 factors. Factor number 1, own price of a commodity. Factor number 2, income of the consumer, on the basis of which you can classify the goods as normal and inferior. Factor number 3, price of related goods, on the basis of which you can classify the goods as substitutes and complements. Factor number 4, taste and preferences. Factor number 5, expectations about the future. And factor number 6, number of buyers, influencing the demand for a commodity. So there are 6 factors which affect the demand for a commodity. You will find all these 6 factors explained in depth in my lecture notes as well. Okay, so now the only thing left for us is to do a case study in today's lecture, and then we stop. So let's talk about case study. So one of the interesting case studies is the ways to reduce the quantity of smoking. Quantity of smoking demanded. Now this is the case study which I have picked up from Gregory Mankiw, which is your book for the entire semester. We want to see what are the various ways in which we can reduce the number of cigarettes smoked. All of us know that cigarette smoking is injurious to health. Okay, so let us see what are the various policies which can be adopted to reduce the quantity of smoking demanded. So the first policy which we have, policy 1. Okay, so policy 1 would be that one way to reduce smoking is to ensure public service announcements, mandatory health warnings, okay, on cigarette packages, and prohibition of cigarette advertising on TVs. So basically, policy one is about creating awareness. How do we create awareness among the public to stop smoking? There can be public service announcements. There can be mandatory health warnings. Now, if you look at a cigarette packet, it's clearly written on it that smoking cigarette causes cancer. It's a mandatory health warning. Another way would be to remove all the advertisements from the television where people are smoking cigarettes. Now, if you look at policy one, what will this policy cause? Will this policy cause a shift in the demand curve or a movement of the demand curve? In policy one, nothing is happening to the price. No change is happening in the price of cigarettes. What is happening? There is awareness which is being created among the public to stop smoking cigarettes. Now, this policy will be clearly causing a shift in the demand curve because nothing is happening to the price. If you clearly look at policy one, there is no change in the price of cigarettes. They are still the same. But because of the awareness which is being created among the public through advertisements, through mandatory health warnings, through public announcements, what will happen? The demand curve of cigarettes itself is going to shift to the right. So this is the demand of cigarettes on the horizontal axis. This is the price on the vertical axis. So this was the initial demand curve. And you can clearly see that this policy will cause a shift in the demand curve. That means at the same price OP, quantity demanded of cigarettes will fall from OQ to OQ1. We move from point A to point B. So I hope all students have understood the first policy. So now let's look at the second policy. Policy 2. Now, policymakers can raise the price of cigarettes. Now, guys, what's one of the methods of raising the price of cigarettes? Suppose the government imposes a tax. Suppose the government raises the tax on the manufacture of cigarettes. So I can say, we can write it like this: government raises the tax on the manufacture of cigarettes. Now this tax is imposed by the government on the producers, but the producers will pass on the burden of this tax to the consumers, because cigarette is like an inelastic commodity. It's a habit. Even if the price goes up, people who are addicted to smoking will still go and buy cigarettes. So if the government imposes this tax on the manufacturers, I can say the manufacturers will pass on this burden of tax on the consumers. So now what is happening? Consumers are paying the higher price for cigarettes in the form of more taxes. Now, is it causing a shift in the demand curve or a movement along the demand curve? All of us know the answer. It will cause a movement along the demand curve. So quantity demanded of cigarettes, price. This is my demand curve. And now what is happening? When the government raises the tax on manufacture of cigarettes, the manufacturers will pass on the burden of this tax to the consumers. As a result, the consumers will now be paying a higher price for cigarettes, which will reduce the quantity demanded of cigarettes. So I hope students have understood this case study regarding what are the various ways in which we can reduce the quantity of cigarettes smoked. One policy is to impose more taxes, which will cause contraction in demand for cigarettes. Okay. And another policy is not to change the price, but to create awareness among the public. That itself will cause a shift in the demand for cigarettes to the left. So now we can argue as to which policy is better. Now, in case of policy 2, the good thing is the government is also getting the revenue. In case of policy 1, there was no change in price, so government was not getting any revenue out of it. In case of policy 2, the government also gets tax revenue from cigarettes, from raising the price. But understand this, in the long run, which policy is better? Policy 1. Okay, policy 2 will have an impact immediately. But understand this, policy 2 might not be very successful because for people for whom smoking is a habit, they will still buy cigarettes even if the price goes up. Because cigarettes have inelastic demand. Inelastic demand means even if the price of cigarette goes up, people will still buy it because they're addicted to it. So policy 2 might not be very helpful. But in case of policy 1, even though policy 1 will take in effect gradually, but it's a better policy because you are ultimately hitting the psychology of the people. You're making them educated about the harmful effects of smoking. So even though policy 1 might take time, but it's a better policy than policy 2. Okay, so with this, our lecture on demand is completely over. Now, in the next lecture, we will be talking about supply. So today I
Sir,
stop. Yeah, you can ask your doubts now.
sir, can you explain? Can you draw the policy 1 curve once again, sir? Can you explain it?
So in case of policy 1, so right now I'm taking doubts. Okay. And in case of policy 1, where you are creating awareness among the public to reduce smoking, now there will be no movement along the demand curve. There will be a shift in the demand curve. So if this is my demand curve, when there is advertisements to stop smoking, when there are mandatory health warnings, nothing is happening to the price. The price of cigarette is the same, but those are impacting the psychology of the people who smoke, which in turn causes the demand for cigarettes to shift to the left at the same price. So this is what is happening in case of policy 1. Mandatory health warnings, okay, removal of advertisements on smoking, all these are causing the demand curve to shift to the left at the same price. Whereas in case of policy 2, price itself was rising, which was causing a fall in the demand for the cigarette smoked. So I hope now I have convinced regarding policy 1.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, so I stop in the lecture today. Okay, so I hope students have enjoyed the lecture. You can, for any doubts, you can call up or you can mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. Okay, now I request students to leave this meeting and join back again using the same link. Okay, please join back again using the same link.